Okay, I think we are good to start. Hello, everyone behind the screens. My name is Aisha Al-Sarihi. I am a research associate at CAPSERC. I'm also a T20 coordinator for the Taskforce Climate Change and Environment. Thank you all for joining us today, and welcome to this special webinar on coronavirus and climate, converging global crisis. To begin our webinar, we are very much delighted that the T20 Chair and the Vice President of Research at CAPSERC, Dr. Fahad Al-Turki, is joining us today to give the opening remarks. Dr. Fahad Al-Turki, thank you very much for joining us. I would like to give the mic to you to give the opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Aisha, and good morning to our guests from the East, and good afternoon for our guests from the West. I'm delighted to be connected with you today for this special and important webinar on the impact of coronavirus on a specific and important topic, which is climate change and environment. I'm grateful for the lead co-chair, Dr. Noura Mansouri, for her effort in leading this task force with the genuine help and support from many of the scholars that are joining us today, and they are the co-chairs of this task force, as well as very important contribution from the co-authors or the lead authors and the co-authors and the members of this task force. So thank you very much for your contribution and so on the policy briefs. We definitely, the reason for this webinar is that we want to increase the communication between the T20 community and the G20 leaders, especially on issues related to COVID-19. We are living in unprecedented time with this pandemic, and I don't want to go into the discussion of how this changed our ways of lives and the way we do our work. I think in many occasions we talked about this more often, but I think if we want to highlight something more on the subject, I guess the priority for the countries, which is reasonable to be assumed, that protecting human health, and that is, as many other medicine for this crisis, is coming at a very major cost, which is a socio-economic cost. If we look at the early estimates of the socio-economic impact of the pandemic, we see that global economic growth is turning into a negative territory. Unemployment is rising in many countries. SMEs are going out of business, and so on and so forth. These are probably and hopefully will be short-term lived consequences of the pandemic, and we will recover from them. There will be other long-term effect of the pandemic, and these are related to some pressing issues, including climate change and the environment. And I think if we get out of this pandemic with one important message, that international collaboration and the role of multilateralism is important in facing this pandemic and also other related issues on climate and so on, I think that is an important lesson, and to keep it up and maintain that enthusiasm or approach in collaboration, not only for resolving the pandemic, but also on addressing climate-related issues. On climate specific, over the 3 months that passed under this crisis, we've seen emission decline globally, and we've seen fossil fuel consumption declining and also contributing to emission decline. And I think if these gains should be kept moving forward. And if we look at different asset prices within different markets globally, we see that major stock markets and assets are falling. And relatively, if you look at the green financial assets, you will see that they're relatively was not impacted by as much as other assets. And if there is a lesson there, and it's saying, especially for this task force, that the more sustainable our economies get, the stronger we will be, and more resilient, and less impact on the society we will see moving forward. I'm grateful for this task force policy submission, policy brief submission, which happened since the start of April. And through the review process, I believe many of these policy briefs are returned now to the authors. And the second submission will be for next June. So thank you very much for your contribution. I believe there was a very short window to include related issues to COVID-19 within the first draft, but I think that can be incorporated, building on the discussion during this webinar and also other meetings for the task force, to incorporate the impact of the COVID-19 on our policy recommendations. So when we give these recommendations to the leaders of the G20, they'll be more timely and relevant to the issues that are being discussed among the leaders themselves. So thank you very much, and I wish, I hope there will be a lively discussion today. I look forward to the discussion and also the questions from the member of the task force. Back to you, Aisha.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fahad. So next on the agenda, we have the task force statement. And for that, we are very much delighted to have the lead co-chair of the Task Force 2 on Climate Change and Environment joining us today, Dr. Noura Mansouri. Thank you, Dr. Noura Mansouri, for joining us, and it is over to you.
Thank you very much, Aisha, and I would like to thank Dr. Fahad for all the support that we're getting for the task force. Welcome everyone, and thank you for attending this webinar. I hope you are all doing well and are safe and healthy. Coronavirus is an unprecedented global challenge that requires a coordinated global response. Fighting this global threat necessitates effective multilateralism, as was Dr. Fahad saying, through international cooperation and coordination, and also for laying the foundations for a strong economic recovery, one that offers a sustainable, balanced, and comprehensive growth after the pandemic. This crisis comes at a time when the world is already grappling with so many challenges, including the energy security on one end and climate change on the other. COVID-19 has distracted governments all over the world. 2020 was supposed to be the year of action for environmental negotiations, as both the Biodiversity Cup and the Climate Cups were set to be major environmental milestones. Under the Paris Agreement, this year was supposed to see countries raise their ambition and start to update their NDCs. COVID-19 has led to the cancellation, of course, to a long list of global major events, including the UN's Biodiversity Cup and the Climate Summit, COP26 this year. Thus, the G20 thus must fill the gap. The G20, with a central theme this year of realizing opportunities for the 21st century for all, empowering people, safeguarding the planet, and shaping new frontiers. Its role is indeed amplified. The G20 leaders committed to unify against this common threat of COVID-19. In fact, the G20 presidency called for $8 billion to combat coronavirus. Riyadh pledged $500 million. Due to COVID-19 lockdowns, the world experienced a historic carbon crash, cutting global CO2 emissions back by 4 to 8%, approximately 2 to 3 billion tons. Transportation, both air and road, have contributed most to this fall in emissions, which according to the IEA has fell to 50% of the 2019 level by the end of March 2020. In China, just 2 months of reduced pollution is likely to have saved the lives of 4,000 children under the age of 5 and 73,000 adults over the age of 70, according to a study by Marshall Burke from Stanford University. The air may have cleared, the emissions may have lowered, but the takeaway from this pandemic is not whether it has left the environment better or worse. It is not either us or the environment. Rather, if we can build a more sustainable post-pandemic world that balances between economic development, social prosperity, and environmental sustainability. The IEA identifies this as a historic shock to the entire energy world, where the world will use 6% less energy this year, the equivalent of losing the entire energy demand of India. This ruthless shutdown of the world's economy is not the answer, not to the climate change problem, nor to the COVID-19 crisis. We have to acknowledge that lower emissions are due to global economic paralysis, leading to collapsing oil industry, dropping oil prices, affecting oil economies, and causing a global recession. The coronavirus pandemic is a tragedy, felt harshest and hardest by our most vulnerable population, the poor, the elderly, the homeless, the stateless, just how climate change will be felt. The ILO chief, International Labour Organization, says nearly half of global workforce is at risk due to COVID-19, which could cause about 195 million job losses globally. In the USA alone, COVID-19 related job losses reached 26.4 million, the highest since the Great Depression. The world witnesses about 15 million climate-related migrants being displaced every year. Now, this displacement takes place under a pandemic. And at a time where the emphasis will shift to national recovery as a priority, in this context, climate change may seem like a luxury. The idea of spending scarce money on solar rooftops, electric vehicle charging stations, or renewable energy projects may seem unrealistic. In fact, any global challenges not directly related to COVID-19 today inevitably lose priority and salience. Countries will choose to prioritize economic recovery over environmental concerns, whether we like it or not. This is the reality. So the most important question becomes, what is the path to sustainable recovery? The Saudi G20 presidency is proposing the circular carbon economy, which offers a new way of approaching climate goals that implicitly values all options and encourages all efforts to mitigate carbon accumulation in the atmosphere. The CCE is based on the 4 R's: reduce, reuse, recycle, and remove. Reduce is reducing the amount of carbon entering the system, such as using renewable energy, nuclear energy, and including energy efficiency measures. The reuse is converting carbon to another useful industrial feedstock, such as carbon capture utilization, emissions to value, and recycle is recycling carbon through natural processes, decomposition, and combustion, like bioenergy recycle in the paper and pulp industry, and bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. And finally, remove is removing carbon from the system, such as carbon capture and storage, direct air capture, and nature-based solutions using whales and oceans as carbon sinks. In a post-pandemic stimulus packages, we will likely see fossil fuel bailouts, and the CCE approach is a golden opportunity to ensure carbon circularity and sustainability measures are in place. In our Task Force 2 on climate change and environment, we are working hard to prepare the final key recommendations to the G20 governments. We have 25 policy briefs being drafted today by over 190 co-authors from all over the world, 28 countries to be precise. And as we finalize our key recommendations to G20 government, with COVID-19 as a backdrop, how can we propose solutions to the world's most pressing climate problems that beg for action? We should all attempt to answer this question and reflect it in our policy briefs. Clean energy transition must be at the center of economic recovery and stimulus plans. We have a unique chance for a green, sustainable, and inclusive recovery that not only provides economic recovery, but also integrates strong climate actions for sustainable development. We must see the COVID-19 crisis as a lesson in how to address climate change quickly and cooperatively, and use this opportunity through the T20 to impact change. I would like to end with this hadith: if Earth's final hour comes while you have a plant bud in your hands, then you must plant it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Noura. That was really comprehensive and thought-provoking remarks. Thank you very much for that. And with that, we can move now to the next agenda in our today's program. So next we have a panel discussion. And again, we have Dr. Noura Mansouri, who is going to moderate the panel discussion. And without further ado, I leave it to you, Noura.
Thank you, Aisha, and welcome to our esteemed panelists, who are also our co-chairs of Task Force 2 and have been working very hard since December. So I would like to thank you all for being part of this task force, for your dedication and hard work. Thank you for being here today, despite the time difference. I know John's connecting from Canada, and Ajay is connecting from India. Gabrielle is connecting from Argentina. So we're connecting from all over across the world. I'd like to introduce our panelists. We have Kazuo Matsushita, Professor Emeritus from Kyoto University. He's also a senior fellow at the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies, IGES. Miranda Schroyers, Professor of Environment and Climate Policy, Technical University of Munich, and Vice Chair of the European Environment and Sustainable Development Advisory Councils. We have John Kearton, the Director of G20 Research Group. We have Gabrielle Lanfranchi, Program Director of the Metropolitan Urbanism and University of Buenos Aires, and the Principal Researcher at CPEC. And we have Ajay Mathur, the Director General of TERI, the Energy and Resources Institute, and a member of the Prime Minister's Council on Climate Change. I would like to invite the panelists for introductory remarks, and we would like to start with Kazuo. Kazuo, you have the floor.
Thank you, Noura, for your kind introduction. I will talk about climate change and COVID-19, focusing on their similarities and differences, and then advocate green recovery from COVID-19 crisis. Can I have my slide?
Yes. Shall we start from here?
Yeah, okay. Next slide, please. I hope you agree that climate change and COVID-19 are both important issues related to the survival of humankind, and that the international community should work together. They are deeply related to the economic globalization. Following the SARS in 2002 and MERS in 2012, the appearance of COVID-19 for the third time in 20 years is an abnormal frequency. Possibly it is due to the changes in ecosystem relating to climate change and chaotic development and the changes in distance between humans and wildlife. For both problems, we need a high level of crisis awareness and effective measures. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah, this slide, sorry, one slide back. One slide back, yeah. This slide shows a comparison of measures. Next one, please. Yeah. This slide shows a comparison of measures against climate change and COVID-19. As for similarities, first, importance of credible scientific knowledge. Second, they require changes in the way people work and live. Third, coordinated measures by the international community are necessary. Fourth, large-scale fiscal spending to support the measures are necessary. As for differences, climate change measures include transition to sustainable energy, improvement of energy and resource efficiency, lifestyle change that do not depend on material consumption, and to an economic system that contributes to higher quality of life and people's well-being. Fiscal spending such as sustainable infrastructure development and new technology development is regarded as an investment, and greater economic returns can be expected. Whereas for COVID-19, it is essential to avoid contact between people and to limit economic activities or movement of people, which may require sacrificing of the quality of life, and fiscal spending to cover economic loss is regarded as economic cost. Next, please. Reduction of economic activity due to COVID-19 resulted in the reduction of air pollutants and greenhouse gas emissions, as in China. But these environmental improvements are short-lived and temporary. On the other hand, there is a possibility that the economic stagnation and contraction due to COVID-19 may delay the implementation of climate change countermeasures. However, emerging new lifestyles and work styles with low environmental impact, such as telework, telecommuting, online meetings, these should be expanded and diffused after COVID-19. Next, please. At the 11th Petersburg Climate Dialogue hosted by Germany and UK on 27 to 28 April, participants emphasized the importance of a green recovery, one that integrates economic recovery from COVID-19, climate action, and the SDGs. The recovery process serves as a critical occasion to materialize much needed transformative change towards sustainable society. Green recovery measures should contribute to the transition to a decarbonized society and the realization of SDGs. And the unlimited economic globalization should be re-examined from the perspective of increasing resilience of local communities, countries, and the world. Next, please. This slide shows that post-COVID-19 economic recovery measures are critical to the attainment of the Paris Agreement. In the past, after the global economic recessions, greenhouse gas emissions fell, but soon after they rebounded. Currently, IEA projects 8% CO2 emission in 2020. However, in order to attain 1.5 degrees centigrade target under the Paris Agreement, CO2 emissions should be reduced more than 7% every year. Therefore, post-COVID-19 green recovery measures are critical. Okay. Next, please. We need the energy shift to clean energy. The next slide, please.
This one?
Next one, please. Yeah, EU is leading in this area by adopting the European Green Deal towards achieving the global goal of making EU virtually zero greenhouse gas emission in 2050. And also EU confirmed that Green Deal will be firmly maintained and promoted despite the economic recession caused by the new coronavirus. And Korean ruling party won general election in April with the manifesto of Korean Green New Deal, which stipulates carbon neutral by 2050, which is the first in Asian countries. Next, please. In conclusion, COVID-19 is a complex crisis of loss of nature, human survival, the amplification of crisis due to inequality, and the political and economic systems that are not prepared to overcome the crisis. Climate change measures that can lead to a higher quality of life are significantly different from the measures against COVID-19, which limit the connection between people. But the same awareness of crisis and urgency should be applied. It is necessary and possible to carry out urgent and effective measures through a science-based, transparent, and democratic process. Global green recovery, which integrates economic recovery from COVID-19, climate actions, and SDGs, would lead to a safe and fulfilling life and to realize a vision of a carbon-free and resilient society towards the year 2050. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Kazuo, for this comprehensive and great comparison between COVID-19 and climate change and laying out really the ideal way of planning economic recovery. Next, we move to Miranda. Miranda, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you very much. I really appreciate this opportunity to speak with all of you, and I'm going to speak without PowerPoints, but I would like to highlight some of the points that have already been made by Nora Mansouri and Kazuo Matsushita, and perhaps put a bit of a new twist on them as well. For one, I think the coronavirus is showing us that societies can be very, very heavily impacted by unexpected crises. And this is something that we should learn, and it's something which unfortunately is likely to occur again in the future, because we will have unexpected major crises associated with climate change. Some of these could be health-related crises, such as the rise of new diseases like the COVID crisis, or diseases that were in the past cleared away or greatly reduced, which we are already starting to see come back, like dengue fever, which has been prevalent again in parts of India and Pakistan, or malaria, which we're seeing also spreading in parts of Africa. and could make their way into regions where it's been largely done away with in the past. Climate change is a potential existential risk, much like COVID-19. But of course, there are also many other dissimilarities between these two areas, as has already been mentioned to some extent. What I would like to do here is really focus on how we can learn out of COVID-19 and learn in a way that might help us to deal with the climate change crisis. And I think one very important lesson out of the COVID-19 is that human society is quite capable of making rapid transitions and changes. And something that has been tremendously remarkable in the last 3 months is that although we have been asked to stay at home, although we have been asked not to go to school or to work outside of our normal workplaces, and in some cases people losing their actual jobs, we are seeing tremendous amounts of innovation associated with this crisis. And so in a matter of a short time, we are now holding webinars like this one that are linking people from around the world. And we are teaching in schools and in universities through digital technologies. We're seeing rapid improvements in these digital technologies. We're seeing sharing economies emerge so that restaurants are shut down in terms of people not being able to go to them, but communities figuring out how nevertheless to support those restaurants by taking out food from them. Or we're seeing communities come together to help older people who are closed in and can't themselves go out and go shopping. So we're seeing a lot of potential here of societal creativity and innovation. And I think this is something that we will desperately need in relationship to climate change. So I think we can learn out of the COVID-19 crisis. And in fact, it would be a tragedy not to learn out of this tragedy. We can find new ways that allow us to be together, even to be together better than in the past by bringing people together from around the world without necessarily having to do as much road travel or as much flying. We will see ways of helping people think about how do we reduce the quality of how do we reduce the amount of pollution to improve the quality of our life, to improve the climate conditions, because we're seeing that this is also something that is a real benefit from a rapid transition that we're seeing right now. Another very important lesson out of the COVID-19 does have to do with the shock in terms of the reduced air pollution. The way this has happened is not, of course, something we want to replicate. It's not something we want again in the future. But if we learn the lessons out of the cleaner air, the cleaner water, the less amount of plastic in the oceans, these can help improve long-term quality of life and long-term health conditions. So we're talking a lot now, very importantly, about the number of people who are suffering from COVID-19 and the health and death associated with it. We need to spend more time thinking about how many people have shortened life expectancy or early death because of air pollution problems, water pollution problems. And here too, we can see the link between the COVID-19 and the climate change and environmental lessons that are to be had. Perhaps the biggest thing we still need to learn will be related to how we try to deal with post-COVID-19 recovery. And here we have an opportunity to do some win-wins, or we could make some major mistakes. And because many economies will be suffering and they will have large debts to have to pay back, it's important that the resources that are spent now to help economies recover are done in such a way that they help to improve efficiency of resource use and energy use, that they are invested into remaking economies, remaking urban areas in a way that improve resilience, meaning that they'll be stronger against the next crisis, but they will also help to provide new jobs in new directions, because we know that technologies are developing, we know that new possibilities are emerging. So we should use the dollars that we are investing into our economies in the COVID-19 recovery in a way that helps to provide for a stronger, more climate resilient, environmentally friendly, and people-friendly world for the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Miranda, for this very inspiring lessons summarized from the COVID-19. And I hope the co-authors that are listening will take some ideas of how to implement these lessons in the different task force, in the different policy briefs. Moving on to the next speaker, John, you have the floor. Mute.
Better?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Great. Bonjour, bienvenue. Greetings from the North American community. I think, as my colleagues have pointed to, that we really are at two critical turning points right now. The first is a pivot from a focus overwhelmingly on COVID-19 control, and about 2,000 Americans died just yesterday, to the point where we have to focus on it and climate change together, certainly in those parts of the world where the season is about to start for hurricanes, fires, floods, and other extreme weather events. I mention these because they're visible. People know they directly die from them, but we must always keep our focus on the invisible. And here, I think not in the first instance of the emissions, even though we've had a minor temporary sabbatical over the past couple of months, but it's the concentrations that count. And every day of lockdown over the past 2 months, those concentrations of greenhouse gas emissions have gone up, up, up. We're closing in very rapidly on the 415 threshold, so no time to lose. The second pivot, I think, is, as Fahad said, is that we have to confront simultaneously not just the health crisis and the climate crisis, but the jobs crisis and the income crisis. So 4 crises all together. And how might we go about doing that? Clean bodies and a clean environment, but in ways that give people the jobs they need with the debt loads that they and their government can bear. And that is, I think, what Miranda wisely ended with. So I have several measures that stand out for what G7 governments can do right here, right now. The first is end fossil fuel subsidies. G20 leaders promised to do that a long time ago, September 2019. They've repeatedly promised to do it, but they haven't done it yet. So now every G20 government should give money of their own, and through the IMF and the World Bank, and they control what goes out to recipient countries only on condition that the recipients don't use it to subsidize fossil fuels, don't use it to build no coal-fired electricity generation plant, and to countries that show before they get a dime that they have a credible plan to spend the money in ways that promote both human health and that control climate change. 2, stop agricultural subsidies, the ones that foster deforestation and carbon creating animal agriculture, such as methane from cows. Meatpacking plants are now the epicenter of the COVID-19 crisis in the United States, Canada, Germany, and elsewhere. They're the creators of the second wave, so they require action right away. Third, shift subsidies to renewable energy. It's a job-rich sector. It can quickly employ the poor and the young. One can start with on and offshore wind power and solar power. There's some places in the world where those sectors need a bit of help. But I think the focus should be on pumped and run-of-river hydroelectricity, wave power, tidal power, and geothermal energy. Anyone can do that. My vision is a heat pump in every backyard. Fourth, plant 1 trillion trees by 2030, starting now with the G20 doing its fair share, which is almost all of it. This is the ultimate shovel-ready project for economic and employment stimulus, and it brings many health and climate benefits as well. 5, stop banks from financing unsustainability. Don't let them use our G20 government's bailout money or bridging finance to support the deadly fossil fuels, and force all of the firms getting our government's money, our taxpayers' money, to provide a credible, ambitious plan for worker and customer safety on the health side, and for climate change control. And the Financial Stability Board ought to be able to help a lot on that. A few more thoughts about specific sectors. One, the digital economy and our digital lifestyles, which are booming. But growing with them is the need to cool their massive servers in their hot, unhealthy buildings, and they rely to a large extent on fossil fuels. That, I think, we need to act on. Servers should shift to the Arctic regions where it's cool all years around. In the United States, in Canada, in the Russian Federation, elsewhere. But you need a common regime to govern the global spread of the data that those server nodes promote. Here last year at the Osaka Summit, leaders agreed on digital free flow with trust. We need to build on that start and give it a broader definition right now. The tourism industry, about 10% of the global economy, particularly important for employing the young, the poor, and women to how do we shift the tourism industry. G20 tourism ministers recently met April 24th, but they didn't give us much of an action plan on that. Certainly we can shift the tourism industry to places, to subsectors where physical distancing is routine. Outdoor biking, hiking, mountain climbing, sailing, swimming, forest, bathing, the list goes on. Infrastructure, a G20 favorite since the Brisbane Summit of 2014. We know we need safe, sustainable cities now. They're the dense concentrations where the COVID epidemic erupts. We need all G20 cities to follow the lead of a few pioneers to replace their air polluting cars that clog their congested streets with active transportation corridors, walking, biking, and similar things, and put some underground as well alongside the subways they use there. So there's many solutions, low-cost ones, immediately at hand. Our task force is working on some of them, but to get it right, we need your help. So look forward to staying in touch. Thanks.
Thank you very much, John, for this comprehensive and actually a reality check on what's going on in the G20 at the backdrop of this crisis. And a lot of what you touched upon is actually being tackled in a number of policy briefs. So I hope those co-authors are taking note. Next, we move to Gabrielle. Gabrielle, you have the floor.
Nora, thank you very much. Well, I think that this is a unique situation that we are going through, unexpected, and it's absolutely making us think about what changed and what might change for the way we are facing climate change. In particular, I have 7 ideas that I would like to share with you. The first one is about the narrative. We've been struggling a lot on how to develop an approach, a friendly approach, let's say, between environment and economic development, because there was no way to put economic growth out of the question. But COVID arrived and is teaching us that those countries that actually didn't manage to have that debate on time are paying now with terrible amounts of deaths and health issues, that I would say. So I think that this is somehow changing the way we see and we can frame the problem. Secondly, Corona tells us that extremely optimistic scenarios in greenhouse emissions reductions are possible. Not desirable in this way, of course, but we can do that. It's not impossible to achieve that if we find a way to reduce very fast the way we are producing those emissions. Third, the crisis, I think, stressed the importance of territorial based approaches. Cities are mainly the hotspots of this coronavirus crisis, and it's also the hotspot of gas emissions. So as climate change issues, it's a dual approach, and it's local and it's global at the same time. And that requires a very, let's say, sophisticated way of developing policy. For example, 70% of gas emissions are generated in cities, but only 25% of those emissions, in the case of Paris, for example, can be handled by local regulation. So we need to understand how to combine a set of different regulations from national to local and even global in order to reduce the amount of emissions that we are creating. This COVID crisis is also showing us the relevance of technology. We were spending huge amounts of money in global conferences, and now we can have them from home, just like we are doing now. It's an amazing opportunity to read the names of the different authors here in the room. So I'm very thrilled with that. And I think that we will see a lot of less traveling and much more exchanging in the time to come. The next idea is that we need to think the problem in 3 different time frames. What's going to happen to climate change in the short term? I think we will struggle to get funding for many of the projects and the ideas that were just about to be launched due to the change of focus of global policy. But maybe in the meantime, while we change, we start to deal with what it is called the new normal. The new normal might take us to experiments, to tactical experiments. For example, here in my city, during this weekend, the government announced that 100 streets will be turned into pedestrian. And that's something that was even unbelievable a couple of months ago. So we can start to see that not only at a local scale, but also at a global scale if our leaders manage to do that. That's why this G20, I think, is extremely important, and we can help a lot from the T20 with ideas to innovate and produce that. The other idea that I wanted to share is that as in climate change, inequalities are accelerated by this virus crisis. And is the climate change a world problem? Yes, it is. But this crisis is showing us that inequalities seems to be the real problem underneath everything. So if we understand how to face those inequalities, we will be tackling a huge part of climate change. And I'm not sure that we are always having that sort of approach. And finally, the world had many situations of global health in the past, and we overcame it. The last one was control through the construction of infrastructure. And now I think, and that's how our metropolitan areas were shaped. Thanks to those crises actually made our cities stronger, bigger, and healthier. But this time, I think that in this century, the new challenge is about organization. How we get organized to face the unpredictable. And in this sense, I think that sustainable infrastructure will be the physical result of this new way of getting organized. And hopefully, also nature-based solutions will start taking part as the billion trees that we need to bring back to our countries and our communities.
Thank you very much, Gabriel, for these very insightful ideas. Indeed, we must not go back to the old normal, but create a new normal where we learned from all the different mistakes and try to tackle inequality, which is an incredibly important element that we shouldn't forget about when we tackle climate change. Last but not least, I would like to give the floor to Ajay.
Thank you, Nora. I would like to focus on how demand for energy will change. And the first step in this is to understand what we look at as the future of the COVID pandemic. We are clearly seeing a large increase in the infection rates, in the death rates. Will it be so in the future as well? The current infection rates, death rates, and lockdown more than anything else have resulted in a huge drop in the economy. Kazwo's slides showed that. If we look to the future, we can look at, in all realism, probably three scenarios. One is that as the lockdown opens, there is a huge second wave of infections. Many more people are infected, lot fewer die, but what it implies is that there is a lot of loss of productivity due to the illnesses that are caused by the second wave of infections. A second scenario, which resembles what happened in the Spanish flu epidemic of 1918, 1919, is that there are a number of infection peaks, not just one. So there's one, goes up, comes down, goes up, comes down, but they keep on declining till they go to something which is very low. But again, the point is that it calls for recurring infections and consequently recurring losses of productivity and consequently of energy demand. The third scenario is that they don't disappear to zero, but we have to live with it. So there are constantly recurring infections that occur again and again and again and again. And we live with it. As a society, as human society, we learn to live with it. We don't know which of these scenarios will come true. Clearly, what we would like is a scenario in which the infection never comes back. It goes away and never comes back. But history tells us, the epidemiology tells us, the virulence of the virus tells us that that is not a possibility. So we are stuck with scenarios which call for productivity losses and consequently call for energy demand reductions in the future. So we have seen that the energy demand has come down. Kazuo had a graph showing that. Will it come back like a V, goes down, goes up again? Kazuo's, I think, a very perceptive graph said that every time when there has been a lowering of the CO2 emissions because of some reason or the other, it has increased again, but the tangents on the graph showed that every time we have started growing from a lower normal. That is clearly one of the things we can expect in the future. That energy demand will start growing again, but will grow from a lower normal. But it is quite possible that the energy growth may be much slower in the future than it has been in the past. Take, for example, all of us, I think here, would be talking from our homes because we are working from homes. A major Indian IT company has decided that by the year 2025, 75% of its people would be working from home. This has huge implications. It has huge implications for transportation energy. It has huge implications for the kind of energy you use in workspaces, air conditioning, space conditioning. What does this tell us in the long term? In the long term, it suggests that energy growth is going to be lower, but the patterns are still unknown. If I was an energy supplier, what would I do? I would look, if there is a great degree of uncertainty, I would look much, much more at lower operating costs, because that is where I will make the largest amount of margins based on the unpredictability of demand. This leads us to the conclusion that in the future, we will probably have capacity markets and we will have variable energy markets. So to a large extent, such kinds of markets exist in electricity in many countries of the world. We will see a growth in that, but we'll also see a growth of such markets in other sectors, the transportation sector, the industry sector, and so on. What would this imply for all of us? It is early days. We are not clear as to how this will unfold, but clearly it makes sense for all of us to see what is the kind of impact that these changes would have both on the energy demand side and consequently on the energy supply side. We also need to think out what this would mean in terms of the global supply chains that occur. We are already seeing the rumblings in various economies of various sizes about the length of the supply chains, how the length of the supply chains makes them more vulnerable to COVID or COVID-like disruptions. What will the world do to shorten the supply chains? I am really fearful on that account, because this is an area where if countries decide that I am going to be an island of my own, I am not going to import or export anything, or minimize my imports and exports, shorten the supply chains to within the country, this will be havoc. It will be havoc for global trade. I would much rather that we work in multilateral fora where changes can be made, maybe short-term exemptions can be granted, so that we move towards a future in which there's a greater degree of predictability for both national actions as well as for global actions. In short, I am worried. I am worried about the changing nature of energy demand and consequently of supply. And I am worried about the way in which this will show up as far as the global changes in the demand patterns and in the global supply patterns are concerned. At the very least, we must make sure that we recognize that these kinds of actions would influence the kinds of challenges that our political leaders in the G20 will face in this year and the next few years. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Ajay, for completing the picture and discussing more deeply the impacts on the energy sector and how you see it unfolding in the near future. With that, I'd like to ask a few questions around the panel and hopefully get some discussions going. And I'd like to start with you, Miranda. How do you situate COVID-19 from environmental and sustainability perspectives and its close relationship to many environmental issues?
Yeah, Nora, I think you've made a really important connection here, because COVID-19 is in part, at least evidence suggests that it has to do with the close connection between the human world and the animal world. And I think we're seeing this in other kinds of infectious diseases as well, that as humans encroach more and more into areas of the nature environment, that it's easier for diseases to spring, to make the jump from the wild world into the human world. So this suggests that we need to do much more on nature conservation. We need to do much more thinking about how we develop our societies and how we at the same time protect nature and environment. I think a second connection we've talked about a bit is the connection with pollution. So air pollution is a major cause of many kinds of different diseases. Asthma is something that has become a worldwide problem. Many, many people now suffer from asthma. Other kinds of chronic lung diseases that are associated with pollution. And these are problems that increase your risk of also having a very serious case of COVID-19 or possible death with COVID-19. So we see a link between the pollution and the COVID-19 crisis. And that too has to do with our lifestyles. So the more our lifestyles are associated with pollution, with emissions, what we're basically doing is increasing potential health and human risks. So I think one really important lesson that we need to take away from COVID-19 is that we need to do something to improve the general quality of the environment, because if we do that, we are also improving our health and we're improving the quality of our life. So this is a terrible shock, but we can really learn out of this terrible shock, and in learning out of it, maybe we can help to solve lots of other problems. So we're always talking about just how expensive all of this is going to be. It will be, but at the same time, just imagine what we could do to reduce healthcare costs, environmental damage related costs, by increasing the respect for nature. And finding ways to develop that are not so polluting and so damaging, because by doing that, we will improve many things and save a lot in terms of damage that we see in other areas. And I also think there's a long-term dimension. Some people have mentioned that as well, that climate change is an issue that's got a long-term dimension to it. So we need to take this step by step, but we can take some big steps in the beginning. And those big steps could really have positive impacts, both for climate, environment, and dealing with COVID-19.
Thank you very much, Miranda. If I can go to you, Kazoo. COVID-19 and climate change, you drew so many parallels, similarities and differences. What is the way forward if we want to talk about both crises?
As I said, there are similarities and differences. And for the time being, the priority should be to protect people's lives and livelihood. And then we will have a sort of mid-term sort of action to have a sort of economic recovery. In that period, I think we have to aim at integrating, as I said in my presentation, integrating measures against COVID-19 and Paris Agreement and the SDGs. We have to have a kind of synergy between these objectives. And we will aim at the kind of core benefits, creating jobs, creating a better economy, at the same time, less impact on the environment. And in that process, we can, of course, use various state-of-the-art technology, including digital communications. And also, as for the economic measures to bail out certain industries, like airline industries or steel industries, we have to have some kind of conditions to do better in reducing emissions of greenhouse gases. Without putting some conditions, then these industries will go back to the normal, normal as before. So taking advantage of this crisis, we have to aim at kind of structural change towards low carbon and resilient society. At the same time, we can improve the quality of life by further improving sharing economy, by further improving communication technologies, using digital technologies, and also sort of creating more green jobs. So these are the things that we have to do collectively and globally. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kazu. Ajay, if I can go back to you, you discussed the energy sector, the supply chain, the way forward. How will the post-pandemic globalization look like?
Nora, that's a tough question. Very clearly, as Miranda, or I think it was you who had said that we will have a new normal tomorrow post-pandemic. What will that new normal look like? As I look at globalization, there are 2 or 3 things that stick out. One is what I had mentioned earlier, that there is this discussion in many countries about shortening the supply chains. That's one. The second, which I'd also briefly mentioned, related to the nature of resolving disputes, whether we do it unilaterally as far as countries are concerned, or do we go for multilateral fora. But I think at the heart of it, the changes will relate to the way in which countries, or let's say people, you and I, and countries deal with the issue of future investments. The key challenge, for the purposes of organizing my thinking, I break up the government packages into relief, which is about giving support to people now so that they can live. Recovery, which is, in a sense, whatever is there, let's get it back and working. And then economic stimulus, which is about building up a society and infrastructure for tomorrow. As we look at these packages, there are, if you look at the European package, the emphasis on investments in greener growth are very clear. They are not that clear in the US package. India announced a package of about $250 billion last night. We haven't had the details, so I can't share with you where this is taking us. But we are seeing the same kind of a divide. Okay, so what does this mean for us? What it there are, a good way of looking at it is that we are looking at a world that would be somewhat more isolationist than it was in the pre-COVID days. But there is also a very strong move towards creating a stronger multilateral process. I think the G20 plays an immensely important role in enabling us to move in that direction. I would like to end by focusing on the ways in which we have looked, the community, the world, has looked at the post-COVID world. I think most people are now beginning to understand that the world of tomorrow will be different. Now, if we can make the point that the world of tomorrow, every economic leader, no matter which country they come from, are focusing on jobs, on sustainable livelihoods, and on economic growth. As long as we can make the point that the only way to do this is through greener means. You cannot have, there are limits to economic growth if you follow the path of the past. You will not have new jobs. If you invest, for example, in newer sectors, you by definition create new jobs which are additional. The chances of their sustainability are much more than the jobs of yesterday. So I think that is the kind of narrative that it would be great to get the G20 to work around. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ajay, for this comprehensive answer. Gabrielle, if I can go to you, how can we tackle inequality and just transition in addressing COVID-19 and climate change?
What we have learned so far is that just transition is key for global security. We need multi-level approaches to achieve that. I mean, just transition requires North and the Global South fair trade for sure, but also within this should be taken into the same nation. We can see a lot of unjust delivery of services of economic development within a same nation or even within the same city. So we are learning that if we don't know how to manage that, it's hard to find good policy and good results. I think the G20 can make a very important contribution by placing these issues within the agenda. It's not easy to do that because the G20 should be focusing on nations and global policy. But I think that a crisis like this one are telling us that we cannot solve the roots of the problem if we don't do that sort of approach. I hope there will be a stronger sense of community after this and a sense also of belonging also. So that's my hope, and if that happens, the basis of commerce should change dramatically and tackling urban inequalities should gain support.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. And due to the limited time, I'll end with this question to John. John, if I can get to you. How can the G20 and the T20 contribute to strengthening international cooperation and solidarity, as well as control global risks in the light of COVID-19? You are muted, John, we can't hear you.
They can do a lot, and they've already started. Globalization is with us. It will continue. It's reached a new stage. COVID-19 has brought it into the sphere of health, and global governance has responded. The emergency G20 summit, first ever, the emergency meetings of many of the ministerials of the G20. So we see the G20 really springing to life. Should the think G20 spring to life as well and advise them as we continue to roll through the cycle rather than just wait to the great culmination in November. So a design question. What I think we need to do, though, is as we look at the various outcomes, certainly the ministerial meetings, is make the connections, make the synergies. So the recent G20 tourism ministers meeting, right? Almost no reference to the natural environment, or in fact to a gender equality, another important Saudi priority, not to mention one of the SDGs. The G20 Energy Ministers meeting, we've discussed energy a lot today, very few connections from there to the environment. So make the linkages right away would be the main messages I would have. And G20 digital ministers, all these things have been done before. And I think we need the G20 health ministers meeting much more often than they have of late. So within our own international institutional family, right, a lot that can be done.
Thank you very much, John. I would like to thank all the panelists for their amazing contribution to the discussion and for enriching this panel really and tackling it from different perspectives. And I'm happy to say that we're preaching what we're practicing what we're preaching in the T20, and we have a very inclusive, representative, and diverse group of co-chairs and panel. Now back to you, Aisha.
Well, thank you very much, Noura, and thank you all to all the panelists and the co-chairs of the task force too for this insightful discussion. And now we are moving and opening the floor to the Q&A. We have 30 minutes window for the Q&A. So if you have any questions, and I've already seen that we have 5 questions on there. So I would like to invite you to write your questions in the Q&A space. And if you have any specific speaker in mind, please write that down so we know to whom we direct the question. But before that, I would like to dedicate the first 15 minutes of the Q&A sessions to invite the authors of the policy briefs to give their perceptions. I have already, I'm looking at the attendees and I see there are too many of the authors of the policy briefs in our task force. So I would like to invite you, if you would like to participate in giving your insights and your thoughts on how the COVID-19 is impacting or changing the direction and outlook of the recommendations of your policy briefs. So if you would like to participate, please raise your hand and so I can. Yeah, so yeah, I see Dr. Mary Lumi. Okay. So Mary, please.
Good afternoon, everybody. Aisha, would it be possible to have the slides on the screen, or should I go without the slides? Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to thank the task force co-chair Noura, first of all, for the invitation to deliver brief remarks on how COVID-19 has impacted our policy brief, which, as you will see, is on empowering the private sector to support rapid, sustainable energy transitions. Next slide, please. I should say I feel like I'm preaching to the converted. So a lot of what I will say in the next 5 minutes will definitely have been said already. As we know, it was clear coming out of COP25 in Madrid that the necessary ambition and leadership among governments was not there. In order to stay well below 2 degrees, the current level of ambition needs to increase threefold in the NDCs. Emissions need to go down by 2.7% every year through 2030. The private sector is needed to support the transition, and G20 governments are crucial, given that their emissions account for about 80% of the global total. Our paper we decided to focus on electricity, given that power demand is expected to keep growing, both in absolute terms through development and relative terms through electrification. The IRENA estimates that renewable energy generation and electrification could deliver 75% of the needed energy-related CO2 reductions. However, the share of renewables in the power demand mix needs to increase significantly from the current 26% to 57% in the next decade. You can go back, please. Still on the same slide. While the global power demand doubles. So the first draft of our policy brief had 3 recommendations. This is the 4th bullet. We looked at rigorous participatory policy processes, which we recommended all governments incorporate, and overall close collaboration in the private sector, in particular with industry pioneers. Our second area focused on regulatory practices, where we looked at things like expanding clean energy capacity through private sector procurement, integrated urban development, and advanced grid operations. Our recommendation there was for the G20 to work on a best practices framework for clean energy transitions on the power sector demand and supply sides. In the third area relating to economic instruments, we suggested, among other things, using spillover taxes and credit guarantee schemes to improve the business case for renewables, and also developing broader Green Deal type schemes. However, since the pandemic started, calls for green recovery have been a major characteristic of policy debates worldwide. These have been driven by fears of climate action being sidelined, intentionally or unintentionally, in bailouts, stimulus packages, or recovery plans. There now seems to be stronger commitment than in the post-2009 world, when the green growth agenda first emerged. But the big question remains, will a sufficient number of governments follow through? It seems clear that if we're to succeed with climate action, economic recovery, job creation, and climate action need to be really fully aligned now. Additional challenges will include fiscal deficits, in particular in developing countries, and the low oil prices. Our team of 15 authors had a coordination call last week, and we collectively felt that our paper needs to be rethought to speak to these fundamental changes in the socioeconomic context. We're now refocusing the paper around stimulus and recovery measures that support the private sector and accelerating a sustainable energy transition in the power sector. It's important to keep in mind that fundamentals of the energy transition and the need for climate action, of course, have not changed, but governments are needed more than ever to support the private sector. 2/3 of the global power mix still comes from fossil fuels. So this is a major opportunity to accelerate the transition to reverse these shares over the next decade. A recent survey of 231 G20 finance officials ranked clean energy infrastructure investment as the recovery policy with the highest economic and climate action impacts. But there's also a danger of slowing down the transition through policies and measures that go the other way. The 3 major areas of our refocus now will be G20 coordination. We will be looking at ways for G20 countries to coordinate their responses, including in consultation with the private sector. In the second area, we'll look at how to, quote unquote, grow the best. Here we will include proposals on ways to support renewable electricity procurement and improve the business case for renewables. In the third area, which we call greening the rest, we will look at measures like mandatory carbon disclosures, carbon pricing, fossil fuel subsidy reform, and just transitions in the fossil fuel power industry. Now I think you have the next slide, please. I would simply like to end by saying that, if I can get the next slide, we are originally a group of 5 different paper proposals, 15 authors, who came together from various different countries with different private sector related ideas. It's been an incredible amount of coordination, and that continues, but we've been able to do that in a very positive spirit, as you'll see. And our overwhelming consensus is that definitely we will need to center all recovery efforts on a green and just recovery. And we hope that the paper that we're revising will contribute in a small way in paving the world not to back to business as usual, but a way forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mary. Okay, next we have Rachel.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great, thank you so much, Noura as chair, and all the panelists for all your messages. They are absolutely spot on. And coming from the Global Alliance on Health and Pollution and having been advocating for this area related to pollution and health and climate change, first of all, having it in the task force as a policy brief has been encouraging enough, but to see these messages being raised in this task force is just giving us an incredible amount of hope. And so I don't think I need to rehash all this mounting evidence base that's linking COVID-19 health outcomes to air pollution, or the mountain of evidence linking air pollution and climate change, because so many of you have already referenced those points. But what I would like to comment on and how this is impacting our policy brief is, by and large, in short, we have the data, we have the health arguments, the economic arguments, and this incredibly long list of really amazing solutions and recommendations that many of you outlined here and that are in our policy brief. And clearly the efforts to reduce air pollution and enforce air quality standards and strengthen regulations, those are absolutely critical now and post-COVID crisis. What we're also hearing with this, and as Miranda quite rightly points out, is we can learn from this. And what we're seeing is that basically politicians all over the world are saying protecting health is more important than the economy. And using health as this argument is absolutely key. And of course, this is one of the main points in our policy brief, but we might need to be even more direct about it. So conveying that message to the G20 is incredibly important, and we know that countries are not going to be able to afford this level of bailout again, and that low and middle income countries really can't afford the bailout in the first place, and they need overseas development aid. And we know that citizens can implement changing lifestyles, and very quickly we have all these lessons that we've learned. But what really are the arguments or the narrative that the G20 governments and donor agencies and low and middle income country governments really need to hear to get them to act, to turn the tides? Is it as simple and basic as saying pollution and climate change are killing people? And how can you as a government say it's not okay to die from COVID-19, but it's okay to die later from pollution and climate change? And I know it's a shorter intervention that I intended, but this really seems to be the crux of it, is can we point out these incredibly important health arguments and say, if you're worried about health, these are the things that you need to do. And you can't tell citizens that it's okay to shut down the economy and prevent people from having a livelihood when we can do it green and we can use this health argument. So the question there then for panelists are, what other arguments or narratives do our governments and donor countries need to hear to get them to act, and can we use this argument of health better?
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Rachel. Okay. So next we have Nicholas Howard. Nicholas Howard, it is over to you.
Thank you very much, Aisha, and good afternoon from Riyadh to everybody participating. I'm the coordinating author on the policy brief, Staying Cool Sustainably in a Warming Climate. Now, Our brief initially focused on the cooling challenge, which I think most people will be aware of. The demand for cooling and electricity has been rising at around 5% compound average growth rate every year for the last 18 years. The equivalent electrical capacity of Germany, Japan, and the UK combined has been added just to power the extra air conditioners over the last 18 years. And on top of that, of course, the majority of those air conditioners are using hydrofluorocarbons, which are thousands of times more powerful than CO2. So if this continues, cooling is going to be probably one of the biggest areas of growth for CO2 emissions. And this was really the initial focus of our brief, was on recommending that we take some of the great initiatives that have been made in an ad hoc way in different fora, such as the Biarritz G7 pledge on high efficiency air conditioning and the Kigali amendment to phase down those highly polluting HFCs and elevate that to the G20 level to really not start a new process, but commit and double down on those initiatives, but with the more powerful platform that the G20 provides. Now, since COVID, and I think this was something that's come through in the panelists as well as in the review remarks we had and from our own authors, that any issues now not related to COVID are really going to struggle to get government's attention and priority. So the question must be, how can green stimulus measures also assist directly with helping the fight against COVID, protecting lives and livelihoods? And cooling is one of these areas that or cooling systems will directly affect our ability to safely return to offices and in transport to fly again, due to concerns around indoor air quality. We've heard a lot from the panelists and the authors of the policy briefs on the outdoor air quality issues and links to health and the probability of mortality due to COVID, but indoor air quality is just as important. And in fact, if we look at the spread rate of COVID, the spread rate indoors is much higher than the spread rate outdoors. And so we really have to look carefully about what is happening inside offices, inside homes, and air conditioning and the circulation of air and air quality is going to be one of these topics that we'll see building managers and environmental engineers as we try to return to the new business not so normal that will get attention. So we've been picking up on these various themes and solutions to reflect a sort of new recommendations, not just to double down on these existing pledges like the G7 pledge and the Kigali amendment, but something that hasn't been covered before, and that's in response to the COVID. So the areas within cooling systems that are really important is that what we'll see is that there will be an increased demand for using fresh versus recirculated air in cooling systems to improve air quality. There's a range of technologies, some existing, some in R&D stages that relate to filtration that can screen out and even destroy COVID and other bacteria and viruses that may spread through air conditioning. There's also discussion about how building managers are using ultraviolet light disinfection of mechanical cooling equipment to make office buildings safe. And we've heard before, and this will be a sort of a longer term trend, that how working from home, many people around the world will be buying air conditioners for the first time to be able to work productively. So, you know, what can the end result of all of this will be what was already a very fast growing area of energy growth, energy consumption, will grow even further, because all of these things, all of these measures to improve air quality also will require higher energy demand from our cooling systems. And so the G20 could make a new contribution by focusing on this issue of indoor air quality, R&D coordination on the technology options to give visibility to these areas, to give people greater confidence that when they return to the office or get in the plane again, that there are some extra measures that have been put in place to ensure well functioning. And I think also most importantly is that in the long term going forward, that the energy efficiency protocols and policies on HFC are really doubled down and strengthened, so we don't lock in high energy consuming appliances and technologies when better ones are already available. So I think that will be, I guess, the change in direction that we'll be looking to take our revised policy brief. And also, I think if we can coordinate together with our other task groups or policy brief authors who are doing parallel work, I think this issue of health, this issue of how we make our environment safe, clean, as well as green, will be something that it would be great to see reflected in our final communique.
Okay, thank you very much, Nicholas, and thanks also to Mary, Lumi, and Rachel. I see no more hands, so I think, and we have 10 minutes for the Q&A for the panelists, and I can see that we have now 9 questions out there. So let me go through them. One of them is by Jane Frederick, and this one is for John. Jane is asking, how can we make sure that all the great policy ideas mentioned by John will remain on the global agenda? What are the conditions that make learning more likely? John?
I respond right away?
Yeah, please.
Thanks. Well, a very important and broad question. So let me start. What I do think we do need is to start with our G20 governors at all levels, the leaders, the ministers, and that could be an expanding array. Which of our G20 ministerials meetings are in charge of buildings and air conditioning is a question that arises. Well, probably those who worry about infrastructure, right, to the built environment. But yes, there's an infrastructure working group. We created a hub at Brisbane. Maybe it's time for the ministers to meet and take up some of these ideas. I think the architectural challenge is to, as we focus on the big end game in November, maybe we need to avoid what I call the COVID crowd out, or if it's the economically and medically safe recovery, that's the focus. We need a full strength agenda, and maybe we need in person or by video conference, a 3-day G20 summit rather than the shorter ones we've had of late. So more issues could be discussed. And I think the agenda setting function and the educational value of the G20, I think is very important. It's been up to, I think, all of us, the task force, I think 20 members, not just to put our ideas in and then move on to other things, but to actually disseminate our results, call the leaders out if they listen to what we think they should do and don't, and then keep going all year round to educate to a broader constituency beyond the elites, which we basically all are, to create a broader mass movement. That's what politicians will respond to in the end. Thanks.
Thank you, John. There is a question from Radia Saadawi to Noura Mansouri. How do you see the contribution of the circular carbon economy in supporting economic recovery for creating additional job opportunities across the value chain of the key industries?
Thank you, Radia, for this question. As I mentioned also in my introductory remarks, the circular carbon economy approach offers a golden opportunity, especially now that we're discussing economic recovery. Especially that, a lot of the economic recoveries will include fossil fuel bailouts. There was a study published by the University of Oxford that said 96% of the recovery will be in fossil fuels, since that has most of the jobs. So it is time to really look at the climate mitigation options as an inclusive approach, and the CCE really offers that, how to integrate sustainability measures and introduce carbon circularity in fossil fuel industries, hard to abate industries, fossil fuel jobs, and so on. So I think that's the opportunity that the CCE gives. There was another question here that I see from Ryan Barlett that's related to the same question, and is also referring to the Oxford study where 96% of $7+ trillion in recovery funds so far have been allocated to the status quo of the fossil fuels, or brown funding, as he puts it. Are we really likely to see the change we need to in this moment, or will it be much more incremental as countries prioritize comfortable continuity over perceived riskier green transformation? Honestly, Ryan, and I mentioned that in my remarks as well, this is the reality, and countries will choose economic recovery over dealing with a distant crisis, unfortunately. So the way forward is really the pathway to a sustainable recovery, sustainable jobs, and sustainable industries. And I would say the oil and gas sector, as well as the hard to abate sectors, and the CCE approach provides that bridge towards a sustainable pathway, and ensures that we are being more inclusive with all the options for mitigating carbon. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Noura, for taking those two questions. Miranda, you wanted to go through this question. We need to focus on biodiversity and environment. Cities in particular need focus in terms of planning. Can the panel please provide insights into urban environment biodiversity aspects? Miranda.
Yeah, thank you. I thought I'd take this and maybe answer one or two of the other questions that I see there. In terms of cities and climate change, also with the health elements attached, one thing we know that people do better when they're in areas that have a little bit more green. And I think something that will be really critical for cities as they emerge out of the COVID-19 and think about recovery is how green can be built more strongly into those environments. Of course, it depends a little bit on what your climate conditions are, but we're seeing a lot of transitions now in how urban areas are being designed and redesigned. Everything from integrating green rooftops or green sides of buildings into architecture plans, to trying to reduce the number of roads and turn roads over into community space. So reducing the amount of land that is used for traffic and increasing the amount of land that is actually used for people and integration. All things which could be very positive for the climate, for health, and lead to new kinds of community interactions. And I think the other thing we're seeing now, there was a question about to what extent is the COVID-19 going to change how we do international negotiations or the role of international organizations. There, I think we as a community of scholars and activists really need to help contribute to letting people hear the message that these international organizations are critical. We need these international organizations. Doesn't mean that they maybe don't need some reforms. It doesn't mean they don't maybe need to be shaken up a little bit, but they're really central to addressing the kinds of global problems we have with COVID-19 or climate change or biodiversity loss. So we really need to support that message that these international organizations are important. In the next year or two, depending on how things develop with COVID-19, it may very well be that we will not see any big international conferences. What does this mean for participation? What does this mean for equal voice? It depends very much on how these things are organized. It could actually increase participation if done correctly, because we can reach many regions of the world. At the same time, we also know that not everybody has a computer, not everybody has a laptop. And since one of the Sustainable Development Goals really is also about equality and education, this could also be an area where we need to pay some attention how we can help the next generation or the less privileged generation as well to become part of a global community that interacts much more strongly in the future digitally than it has done in the past.
Okay, thank you very much, Miranda. I still can see we still have more questions coming up, but unfortunately we are short in time and we have 10 minutes left. And the next item, I would like to move to the next item in the agenda, which is giving updates on the Taskforce 2 on climate change and environment. And I'm going to present that next. I would like to start with this, again, reintroducing the team. So before that, I would like to say really thank you to all of the authors who have dedicated their time and efforts to contribute and write the policy briefs for this task force. Without you, this task force wouldn't exist. So again, it's a pleasure to reintroduce the team behind the task force, the 6 co-chairs who joined the panel discussion today. Thank you for all of your efforts and the dedication since even before the start of the task force. Also would like to thank Dr. Jan Braun, the subject expert matter. Thanks for all your efforts throughout the journey of the task force and for your contribution to review the policy briefs. And here I just want to go back and reflect on the main milestones and achievements of the task force since its beginning and until today. So back in November 2019, we had the call for abstracts, and we have announced the acceptance of the abstracts in January, just a few days before the Inception Conference in January 2020. Between that time and, April 1st, all of the authors have been working very tirelessly and dedicated their efforts to produce the first draft of the policy brief. So between April and today, all the first drafts of the policy briefs are going under a review process through the T20. And I'm going to show what are the next milestones and events that are coming up for this task force in the next few slides. Here I would like to reflect on the number of the policy briefs. So since the announcements for the call of abstracts, and so we have received 116 submissions of abstracts, and because there were similarities between the many abstracts that have been submitted, we have accepted 70 abstracts, and we have merged the what we thought similar in terms of the concept into final 25 abstracts. So in our task force at the moment, we have 25 abstracts which are going to produce recommendations for the G20. And the total number of authors who have contributed in writing those abstracts is 191 at the moment, and they are from all over the world, from 28 countries. And also, since we enhanced this, the community of practice in the T20, we have more than 250 members. Those members are the authors of the policy briefs, and also those people who we unfortunately have to reject. They are also still members of the task force. So here just an overview for where the authors are located, the authors who contribute in writing the policy briefs for our task force. So we have almost from everywhere. We have from Canada, from the US, from Australia, Japan, India, the Arab region, Europe, and the UK, and also South Africa. Here, I just wanted to show the themes and the priorities around which the policy briefs have been developed and revolved. So we have 6 themes around which the policy briefs have been developed. So we have climate and economy, we have marine and coastal zones, we have policy briefs on biodiversity, and policy briefs on sustainable finance, youth and climate, health and climate. So for the authors of the policy briefs, here I would like to show the process through which, so now we have received the first draft of the policy brief, and each policy brief has gone actually under a review process. So for the review process, we have 4 stages. So for each policy brief, stage 1, it was reviewed by 3 reviewers: the subject matter expert, and the lead co-chair, and one of the co-chairs. So for the first stage, it has been reviewed by 3 reviewers. A second stage is we sent the reviewed policy brief to the T20 Policy and Research Committee. And in there, it is again reviewed by another 2 reviewers. So by the end of these 2 stages, we have 5 reviewers per each policy brief. And after we receive the policy brief from the T20 committee, Noura and myself, we make sure to consolidate those reviews and try to make it really simple for the authors of the policy brief to go back to the comments, and so they can develop the policy brief further based on the comments that they can receive. And we are now in the process. We have already shared the reviews of the policy briefs with some authors, and some of the reviews are still in the pipeline. Okay, so what is next? So now what is next in the task force between May and actually November? So, so after each policy brief has been reviewed, it will be sent back to the authors. And we expect that the authors review the policy brief further based on the comments that they have received, and send back the revised version by June 14. And we would like to really emphasize and encourage the authors of the policy brief to take account of the COVID-19 while developing the policy brief further. So as I think Dr. Fahad has mentioned, this will make timely contribution for the G20 presidency. And also another milestone that I would like to highlight on, which is coming also soon, is the virtual workshop in June 15. So this is a real opportunity for all authors of the policy briefs to present their work, and so they can also get further feedback from the audience who will attend the workshop. Next, in July, we expect the final draft of the policy brief. And I think that would be all from the side of the authors. After that, in October, end October, 1st November, that will be the T20 summit. And between July and November, what will happen, we will work on developing a communique with all of the recommendations from the Task Force 2 policy briefs, so we can deliver that during the T20 summit. And finally, we have the G20 Leaders Summit in November 21st to November 22. Here, I just wanted to be fair with the authors again and to acknowledge the hard work from all of the authors. I'm not gonna go through it, but this is just to show the titles of the policy briefs that we have in the task force. So we have here 14, but in total we have 25 policy briefs. And yeah, so this is what I have in terms of the update on the task force. And with that, yeah, it is almost, it is 3:59 now. It is time to close our webinar. I would like to thank all of the attendees who joined us today and stayed with us until this moment. Thanks also very much to the speakers and the panelists. Thank you very much for joining us and for the insightful contribution to this webinar. Yeah.
And thank you to Aisha and Nora for your terrific efforts here.
This was absolutely marvelous.
Yeah, thank you,
Nora.
Panelists, if you can stay, we can take like a screenshot together.
This is going to be the new kind of photography, screenshot conference pictures.
Okay, so 1, 2, 3. And then we can share it.
Lovely. Okay.
Good. Okay.
Okay, bye-bye then.
Very nice
Bye.
to see you
Thank
all.
you very much.
Okay.
Bye.